Final Fantasy VII. This game was a massive turning point in the gaming industry, and it represented a huge shift for anybody who was around playing games at the time. You know it, I know it, but I've actually never played this one until today. But having played through the game for the first time, it really got me thinking about a lot more than just the game itself. It's really easy to look back on where gaming has come and gone in the time since FF7 came out, over 25 years ago. I mean, whether or not you like where gaming is today, FF7 had a huge impact on gaming culture, and it really shaped how AAA modern games are made, thought of, and marketed. Its influence cannot be understated, but I think that sitting through the game even today warrants some new discussion, and that's what I'd like to do here. So today I'd like to take some time to appreciate the original Final Fantasy VII, but also to use it as a way to talk about the ways classic games can change and age over time. Before we start, I'm going to go a bit into my background with the series here. I think it'll help explain where I'm coming from, and if you're not interested, you can just skip with the chapters below. You would have to be living under a rock to not hear about Final Fantasy VII. But growing up outside of the PlayStation ecosystem meant that my exposure to Final Fantasy was actually quite limited. Growing up with Nintendo, most of what I saw from PlayStation was through my cousins at the time, so it was almost all just steel chairs and kickflips. That was until later on when Final Fantasy media was all over the internet and gaming media that I was watching. Through websites like Screw Attack and game trailers, I was introduced to the world of Final Fantasy VII and its characters. And honestly, how could you not think Cloud was just the coolest guy ever when you were like 12 years old? The whole look with the big baggy pants and metal bolts and all that stuff, it's so 90s 2000s grunge cool, and I still dig it. And really, Cloud's edgy vibe was really what attracted me to the series in the first place. Even if I never had a PlayStation, I was still absorbing a lot of that content through cultural osmosis. The idea that despite not having access to the game or the original platform it was on, I still was exposed to the world and characters through alternative media. I wasn't a fan of Final Fantasy and I'd never really played any of them, but whether I wanted to or not, I was watching a lot of content that would refer back to it. I'd see people that I watched online discuss the biggest moments and the plot twists, and even scenes from Advent Children in things like top 10s and listicles. I knew about the long summon animations and all the twists that everyone seemed to love, and I was pretty much only made aware of all this stuff because of the internet. I'd love to know if anyone else was in that situation. I grew up with Nintendo and PC stuff mostly, so I always felt like the Xbox and PlayStation stuff was like a whole universe I had no idea about. You might be thinking at this point, like, why didn't you just go and try these games out yourself? And honestly, I couldn't tell you why. I sort of just convinced myself that it wasn't for me. At some point, I really fell out of turn-based RPGs, unless you count maybe Pokemon, and I really only came back to them quite recently when I started working on this channel. As I got older, I did have my own income, and I tried to get into Final Fantasy more. I started with 15, and I know it's not like the best one, but people were playing it at the time and it was new. I liked it for what it was, but I didn't feel motivated to go play the other games. For me, Cloud in Midgar was really what I thought of as Final Fantasy, and thankfully around that same time they had announced the remakes. I got it on release and I really enjoyed it on my PS4, but it turned out that Remake had this whole thing about changing the timeline, affecting the general story, and it was kind of a sequel in a way to all the other stuff that had come out for Final Fantasy VII. I remember at the time being a little disappointed that it wasn't just a point-for-point remake, and so the second part, Rebirth, obviously continued that storyline. I don't have anything against the remakes, I actually really love them, and I'm still playing all of them as they come out, but it did have that lingering sort of, I wish it was kind of just the original game. After that, I felt like it was finally time. I just wanted to know what the original story was like so I could see it in the remakes. And so that brings us to today. This game is about as old as I am, so there were a lot of options to choose from. You can still find the original PlayStation copy, and greatest hits copies were still in circulation up through the 2010s, so they're relatively easy to find. I remember seeing some at a local EB Games as late as 2017. But there's also, of course, the modern version on current-gen systems. I believe this version is based on the old PC edition, and it introduced a lot of quality of life stuff like disabling random encounters. I remember actually playing this version a little bit when the remake first came out after I'd finished it, because I wanted to see what the differences were, but I didn't end up sticking with it. See, eventually I had this weird thought in my mind that if I was going to play Final Fantasy VII, I'd have to play it the original way. Having the extra options is nice, but I have this feeling that it just wouldn't be the same experience. Obviously, you can just choose not to use those extra features, but it would always feel like a devil on my shoulder. I just knew for certain that eventually I would cheat or use some other thing to speed things up when I got bored, and I would kind of take myself away from that quote-unquote authentic experience. I might get some weird comments here about like you're being an elitist or a purist, but understand, I genuinely do not care how you play your video games. I'm just speaking for myself here. I'm not trying to say you're doing it wrong if you play these games with the extra features. If you want, you can triple the speed and use limit breaks all the way through the game if you just want to see the cutscenes, and that's entirely up to you. But for me personally, I would fear that I'm losing that original experience for good and for bad. I like talking about this stuff, so let's take a minute to talk about subjectivity. I don't even know if that's the right word for it. I like to think of games as art in their own right. With that in mind, I think revisions and edits can hang over video games in a way that they don't really with other media. But I think it's in some ways even harder to maintain a video game's original experience. You have controllers that wear out, screens and hardware that aren't produced anymore, and consoles that were never designed to last into the next century. I think that no matter what you do, your experience will be shifted by versions that you're playing or hardware you're playing it on. There is also something to be said about games that have full motion video and pre-rendered backgrounds. Since they were of course built for lower resolution displays and CRTs, I find that the modern versions can have some strange shading to them, and a smoothness that can contrast a little bit too harshly with the flat backgrounds. I think this is all part of a bigger topic that is probably best addressed in a different video, so we'll just leave it there. Really, all I'm trying to say is that as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to engage with art in the way that the people at the time of its creation would have. I find that concept somewhat fascinating. For me, I really just wanted to experience the game as someone would in 1997. Same controls, same resolution, same long load times. I find most of the time when I'm playing an old game anyway, my brain will just adjust to the pace of it, so it's all good. Needless to say, I ended up playing it on PlayStation. I'll start off by saying I was mildly surprised that I was actually having a good old time going through the game. You may be thinking like, duh, of course you're playing one of the greatest games ever made, but that isn't really always the case. There are many people that play games every day who would never even think to hop into something that's more than just a couple decades old. In retro gaming circles, a lot of people can enjoy dated mechanics, but the vast majority of people who consistently play video games don't often feel the same. The people that are playing older games are more familiar with older games. Whether you like to admit it or not, a lot of people that are maybe younger than you are probably think that some older games are not as fun to play. And while I'm not really saying I personally agree with that, I think it is a perspective to consider. Speaking for myself, I grew up with Ocarina of Time and I can play that game basically any day and have a blast. But I wasn't exposed to as many 8 or 16-bit games, so I don't always have that same ease of entry with that generation. Like I said at the start, this isn't just a review of Final Fantasy VII as it is today, but also a broader discussion about the things I was thinking about playing the game. So let's dig a little bit into how games age. Some games age better than others. There's always this talk about how some things age like milk or others like wine. You might find that the controls are a little stiff or unintuitive, or maybe the game design is restrictive or basic. I find a lot of the best 2D games age really gracefully because their mechanics are just simpler with less possible things to go wrong. Other games seem to age better because they're similar to how things are today. Ocarina of Time set the standard for so much of modern 3D game design that when it re-released on 3DS, it was pretty much a one-for-one port. I think Final Fantasy VII falls somewhere in between. For me, playing it today, I found that it can be slow at times and the movement controls can be stiff. Because you're stuck with a directional pad on a fixed camera environment, it was often hard to judge what direction forward was. And the pre-rendered environments can cause things to be unintentionally confusing as early as Midgar. The graphics are probably the most dated aspect. As much as I find those low-poly character models charming, their animations can make the game feel older than it is. And the full motion videos can feel a little bit silly when it's probably not intended. In battles, the characters and enemies still look pretty great, but I think that if I had to describe the aesthetic today, I'd say it's all very quaint. On the other hand though, I think there's a lot to Final Fantasy VII that holds up really well. Having played the remakes, I was familiar with the materia system, but I found that here it was a lot more fun to experiment with. It feels like you're given a lot more tools, probably because of that turn-based system, and the battle system is still just as fun as it was before. Customizing my character builds to have them specialized in a certain way is really engaging, and I got a lot of mileage out of critting things with Cloud and a baseball bat. One thing I found interesting when comparing the original game to the remakes is the way that they handle parties. In the original game, it's very much up to you as the player to decide what your party is going to be. You always have to have Cloud still, but the other two slots are open for whatever you want. I mostly used Tifa and Vincent throughout the game, but you could really go back and play the game any way you want and use whatever characters are interesting to you. But the remakes are a lot more interested in you learning and getting to know each character, so there are a lot more sequences where you have to play as a specific party member. I thought it was pretty cool that in the original game, you were given a lot more agency over what party member you wanted to devote your time to. If there's something in Final Fantasy VII that has definitely not aged a day, it's of course the music. The main theme is beautiful as ever, and I only grew to like it more and more as time went on. I didn't know that it played in the overworld, and so it was pretty cool to hear it every time I got to set up my characters or save the game. The only problem is I don't think I can play that song because it'll get copyright struck. Of course, the modern renditions of all these songs are really good, but they all originated here and they sound great as well. Soundtracks for games usually age more gracefully than anything else. When games become massive hits, their soundtracks are often equally revered, and even if the original soundtrack was running through low-spec hardware, the melodies carry on through adaptations or sequels. Uematsu had already proved himself plenty of times before FF7, but I think this soundtrack is legendary for a reason. As game design has evolved, I think we've long since passed a point where they age like they used to. I find the way a game ages really depends on what generation it was made in. While I don't think you can argue that certain elements of game design are objectively bad or worse than others, trends certainly come and go. Some older games can have obtuse mechanics or goals, and some might have performance issues that might not be considered acceptable by modern standards. As the years have gone on, it's become a trend to remake or remaster classic games in order to make them more favorable for new players. I think Final Fantasy VII is really special because it's really the best candidate for a remake, maybe ever. It's old enough that the mechanics aren't really mainstream anymore, but it's also new enough that there's a complex narrative worth retelling. And it's also popular enough that it's worth funding that remake in the first place. I tried to think of another game that would work from a sales standpoint, game design, and popularity standpoint, but I was really left with maybe just a few other PS1 games. There are probably dozens of games that might need a remake more than Final Fantasy VII did, but there's probably a lot more games that got a remake when they didn't even need one. But it's safe to say that the sales and popularity are a lot more of a factor than pure game design. And so I think it makes perfect sense that they would remake it as a full trilogy with modern technology. Final Fantasy VII really feels like the birthplace of modern AAA storytelling. Big budget stories with large expansive worlds and characters, along with meaningful cutscenes and high-end graphics. I loved seeing the ways Final Fantasy VII punches as high as it could by mixing full motion video with these 3D polygon characters. It might not have aged the best, but it was always fun to see those moments. Playing through the game, having already gone through the first 2 of 3 remakes, was also a pretty interesting experience. It was really fascinating for me to see what the developers today wanted to change or expand on or reorganize. It feels like there are huge sections of Final Fantasy VII that are deeply entrenched in the world that it was made in. The overarching themes of climate collapse and corporate empires are so on the nose in a specifically 90s way. It feels like the designers just kind of decided to put whatever they wanted to into the game, and it just kind of stuck. I think this era of games is full of experimentation, even in the character designs, with no regard of whether or not it'll fit. I don't know if I mentioned it yet, but I absolutely love the 90s as hell cast of characters in this game. Vincent is the pinnacle of edgelord character design, but he's part of the same gang of characters as Cait Sith. You could argue that their personalities need to show more expressively through their character designs because they're a lot more one-dimensional in their presentation in the game itself. And even if some characters tend to match better with others, the whole cast as an ensemble is incredibly varied even compared to modern RPGs. Final Fantasy in general is just weird, and while the newer entries are much more tonally consistent, 7 feels like they were just throwing any cool idea at the wall and it just happened to stick. Playing through the original game not only made me appreciate this cast of characters, but also their stories. From the start of the game, you'll find Cloud in this dark, depressing town of Midgar, but eventually you end up at a chocobo farm and then a casino. But then that serious tone will show up once again as soon as Sephiroth is there. As someone unfamiliar with the series, those tone shifts threw me off a lot when I played the remakes. I think the classic example in the original game is this 30-minute segment where you go from the valley to watch Aerith get murdered, and then see a terrible, sad video of her mother, and then borrow a kid's snowboard and hit the slopes. I think it's so interesting how important the story of Final Fantasy VII is to the broader cultural landscape of gaming, but it is just ridiculous, and I was never exposed to that ridiculous side of it. Before I'd played any Final Fantasy games, or especially the remakes, Final Fantasy VII began and ended at Midgar, but there's this whole world of ridiculous, eclectic scenes that just show up. The story of Final Fantasy VII is such a cultural touchstone in gaming, with the twist of Aerith's death at the center of it. I was thinking about how the impact it had on people was so huge that I was still hearing about it 10 years later on the internet. Nowadays, it's maybe not quite as exciting. I've been spoiled about it for decades, and the impact of the scene is kind of hurt by that dated presentation. It really feels like it just sort of happens and then you move on. Although the presentation of the story might not have aged as well throughout the years, I think that the micro-narrative of it is still really great. I don't know if there's a better word for this other than micro-narrative, so I'm using it in the sense to explain that Aerith's death feels a lot more involved as a game mechanic and a way to tell a story through game experience. There's the macro narrative of the plot and the greater story, but then there's the micro narrative of the individual player's experience. I was really appreciating the way that this could have completely changed the world of someone who was unsuspecting of it. Maybe you had used Aerith as much as possible up to this point and invested a lot of time and experience into having her as part of your team. She's the only dedicated healer in the party, and she's suddenly ripped away from you. While I didn't feel the impact in the story as somebody in 1997 might have, I absolutely felt the loss of a major party member. I think it really goes to show how older games are very capable of creating really momentous story moments with just the slightest tweaks to the player experience. Big twists can be represented through cutscenes or the narrative, but when you make it part of the actual gameplay, it means so much more. One of my favorite things in a lot of JRPGs is when the profile picture just changes ever so slightly in the menus. Those small details can add up a lot, especially for an older game. While it might not be the very first time a game had done something like this, I think it's the first time a twist was done on this scale. I think the micro-narrative of investing in a character then having it removed from you is a rewarding storytelling method in its own right, even if the macro-narrative plot might not earn it the same way anymore. As the stories in classic games have aged, I find it endlessly interesting to see that players from back in that time reinterpret these stories and find new meaning in them. In widespread gaming culture, Aerith dies might be a meme, but it's also a huge turning point in storytelling for the medium. It's part of the culture of gaming, and knowing about it implies that you are relatively informed about the stories in video games. And a lot like other forms of media, new and old fans will return to these things and find new meaning. It's the same reason why the generally simple plot of Ocarina of Time has been interpreted through countless video essays and lore videos. Final Fantasy VII is the same thing. Even if the story is delivered with simple text boxes and outdated 3D animation, people like me can look back at the game and find new meaning in it despite its age. I'm not super deep into the Final Fantasy fanbase, so I can't really speak for that community, but I think that there's probably tons of people who have reanalyzed the story and themes in Final Fantasy VII. Aerith's death is only one aspect of the greater plot in Final Fantasy VII, but I think it's really interesting to see how much it's meant to people. Regardless of what I thought about its presentation, I think it was really cool to experience firsthand. Older games can be a bit obtuse at times. I probably missed a dozen cool optional things in FF7 just because I didn't want to dig out a guide to get through the game. But I've been having a great time reevaluating old media and taking them at face value. I still play newer games, of course, but I find myself drawn a lot to the simplicity of games from earlier console generations. I remember hearing that music taste is defined mostly in your mid-teens, and I wonder if that's also the case with games. Since gaming is probably the most time-consuming of all popular mediums, I could assume that most people's preferences are dictated by what they were into when they had the most free time. Still, classic games from older consoles are worth taking a look at if you're willing to rewire your brain a bit. And not just the hugely popular stuff like Final Fantasy. There are loads of really interesting and creative games if you know where to look. The point is, if there's some older game that you think might be a little too outdated for you to enjoy, the worst thing you could do is not give it a chance. Use save states, use cheats, use whatever you need to get a good time out of it, and if you're having fun, who cares? Usually, as time passes, only the most famous or the best stick around. It's unfortunate, but that's just sort of reality. Final Fantasy VII is over 25 years old, but in another 50 years, who knows, it might be only one of a few PlayStation 1 games that are relatively accessible. Due to copyright issues or just lack of interest from IP holders, Hundreds of older titles are forgotten and stuck on previous generations. Personally, I don't really blame companies for this happening, but I also think emulation and other solutions should be more available if people aren't given an option to purchase them. Hopefully, as these games get older, people can find better ways of preserving this art and have it ready for people 100 years from now. For me, playing Final Fantasy VII for the first time wasn't some mind-blowing experience, but I'm obviously very glad that I did. But it really kept me thinking about the future of game preservation and just art preservation in general. Aging and the future can be a bit of a downer subject for a lot of people, so I hope you at least had some fun hanging out with this one. Maybe you had some thoughts of your own and you can share them here. If you have something to say, I read every comment, so I'd love to hear it. If you did enjoy this video, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe, and I've got loads of new videos coming down the line, so I hope to see you there for those too. Either way, that's all I've got for today, so thanks for watching and take it easy.